Welcome to Module 6, the sixth and final module of Grammar Fundamentals for a Pluralistic Society. My name is Kate Crowley, and with my co-author, Chad Grossman, from the Speech-Language Pathology program at Teachers College, Columbia University, we have created these modules. This module will discuss some real-world applications in disability evaluations. Let's examine some of the most widely used assessments and see how accurate they are at differentiating language disorder from language difference. We'll take a close look at questions from tests like the PLS-5, the SELF-5, the SELF-P, the CASEL, and the OWLS 2. Here's a question straight from a commonly used language assessment. Here you see one boat. Here you see many boats. Can you think of a reason why this might be an inappropriate question for assessing the language of children who don't speak standard American English dialect? Because the plural S inflectional morpheme is not obligatory in some dialects, actually in many dialects. So this answer, boat, instead of boats, is grammatically correct in these dialects. Can you remember some examples of dialects where the plural S inflectional morpheme is not obligatory? It's not obligatory in African American English, Spanish influenced English, and Chinese influenced English. Remember, with Spanish influenced English and Chinese influenced English, the speaker does not have to be an English language learner. They might be a monolingual English speaker who's using the features of their dialect of their speech community. So if we were assessing a child and they answered boat when we were really looking for boats, we might be tempted to identify that child as having a language disorder. However, if that child's speech community speaks one of those dialects where the plural S is not obligatory, then that child is utilizing language appropriately and in accordance with the dialect they've been exposed to. This does not demonstrate a language disorder, but rather language ability. So let's take a look at another question from one of these tests. This baby eats, this baby, and here we would see a picture of a baby sleeping. So the child being assessed would be prompted to say, sleeps. What morphosyntactic feature is being assessed here? The third person singular S inflectional morpheme. And what do we know about use of the third person singular inflectional morpheme? That it's non-obligatory in some dialects, such as in African American English, Spanish influenced English, and Chinese influenced English. So this baby sleep would be grammatically correct in these dialects. Let's take a look at another question. This is the dog's food. Whose food is this? And we would have a picture of a cat eating food, so the child would be prompted to say, the cat's food. What morphosyntactic feature is this question assessing? It's assessing use of the possessive S inflectional morpheme. But of course, we know the use of this morpheme is not obligatory in some dialects, such as African American English. So this answer, the cat food, instead of the cat's food, is grammatically correct in African American English. In Spanish influenced English, you might come across an answer like the food of the cat, which is grammatically correct in Spanish influenced English. Let's look at another one. This bird is blue. What about this one? And the child would be shown a picture of a red bird and be expected to say it's red. What morphosyntactic feature is this question addressing? It's assessing use of the contractible copula. But as we know, the contractible copula is omitted in some dialects and languages such as African American English and Chinese influenced English. So the response, it read, is grammatically correct in African American English and Chinese influenced English. This woman is a fast runner, but this woman is even faster, and this woman is the fastest. Here we are testing use of the comparative and superlative forms, but what we do know about use of these forms in dialects other than standard American English, that they exhibit variation in comparative and superlative form. So in African American English, Spanish influenced English, and Chinese influenced English, this response, more fast and more fastest, would be an appropriate response. Here's another question from one of those tests. The doll is out of the box. The doll is, and the child would see a picture of a doll inside the box. So here we are testing use of prepositions. But we know that some dialects and languages exhibit variation in preposition use. For example, the doll is on the box would be an appropriate answer in Spanish-influenced English. Chinese-influenced English and African American English also demonstrate different preposition use. And another question. The mom was cooking dinner. Here is the dinner that she cooked. What morphosyntactic feature are we assessing here? We're assessing use of the regular past tense ed inflectional morpheme. But as we know, of course, this morpheme is non-obligatory in some dialects. So this answer, she cook, is grammatically correct in African American English, Spanish-influenced English, and Chinese-influenced English. Here's an example of a prompt used to assess language. Correct how Joe talks when he says, "Me want a hug." What morphosyntactic features are we testing here? We're testing use of subjective and objective pronouns. But as we know, some dialects and languages demonstrate different subjective and objective pronoun use, such as Chinese-influenced English and Spanish-influenced English, where there is no distinction between objective and subjective pronouns. Me want a hug, for example, would be perfectly acceptable in Chinese-influenced English. Here's another example of a prompt. Correct how Molly talks when she says, "I throwed the ball." What morphosyntactic feature are we looking at here? We're assessing overgeneralization of the ed past tense inflectional morpheme. Overgeneralization of this morpheme, however, is grammatically acceptable in some dialects. In Chinese-influenced English, for example, "I throwed the ball" might be a grammatically correct statement. Are you sensing a pattern here? We can see that there is a clear linguistic bias towards speakers of dialects other than Standard American English, and towards speakers of other languages and bilingual speakers. This bias is evident in assessment materials and in examiners. We just took a look at a variety of questions for many often used language assessment tests and found a clear bias in the questions. This bias can lead to the inaccurate assessment and misidentification of typically developing students from linguistic backgrounds other than Standard American English. As a result, minorities are overrepresented in special education programs. Now, what do grammar fundamentals in a pluralistic society have to do with IDEA 2004, the federal law on special education? Here are the congressional findings from IDEA 2004. Studies have documented apparent discrepancies in the levels of referral and placement of limited English proficient children in special education. Further, such discrepancies pose a special challenge for special education in the referral of, assessment of, and provision of services for our nation's students from non-English language backgrounds. Greater efforts are needed to prevent the intensification of problems connected with mislabeling among minority students with disabilities. More minority students continue to be served in special education than would be expected from the percentage of minority students in the general population. The federal special education law is explicit. Evaluation materials must be selected and administered so as not to be discriminatory on a racial or cultural basis. Evaluations must distinguish a true disability from lack of appropriate instruction in reading, lack of appropriate instruction in math, or limited English proficiency. According to ASHA, no dialectal variety of English is a disorder or a pathological form of speech or language. It is the role of the speech-language pathologist to treat only those features or characteristics of speech and language that are true errors and not attributable to the dialect. Speech-language pathologists must have competencies in recognizing all American English dialects as rule-governed linguistic systems, and understanding the rules and linguistic features of American English dialects represented by their clients. Speech-language pathologists must also be familiar with non-discriminatory assessment and dynamic assessment procedures, such as the following: identifying potential sources of assessment material bias, administering and scoring standardized tests in an alternative manner, using observation and non-traditional interview and language sampling techniques, and assessing test results in light of existing information regarding dialect use. Therefore, in order to assess a student's language abilities, we need to know the student's language acquisitional history, which includes their cultural linguistic background and their first language development. We also need to know the morphosyntactic features of the child's dialect or language difference. If we don't know these features, how can the evaluator distinguish disorder versus difference? We also need to know additional factors related to prior experiences, including socioeconomic status, vocabulary exposure, educational history, and migration patterns, which were not discussed in this module series. Further, we need to know what the research tells us are the critical questions to ask parents and teachers to help distinguish a disorder from a difference. This also was not covered in this module series. For additional resources on culturally competent practice, including information on the impact of sociolinguistics, critical questions, and prior experiences, please visit the Leaders Project at www.leadersproject.org. This concludes the module series on Grammar Fundamentals for a Pluralistic Society.